Mark Johnson stared out the window of his home office, a knot of dread tightening in his gut. The manicured lawns and perfectly pruned hedges of their affluent suburb blurred into a mocking tableau. How could everything look so perfect when his life was crashing down around him? Just an hour ago, Lisa, his wife of 15 years, had dropped a bombshell. "I want a divorce," she'd said, her voice devoid of the warmth he'd once found intoxicating. He'd tried to rationalize it, to chalk it up to stress, to anything but the truth that had been gnawing at him for months. Lisa had changed. The late nights out with the girls, the unexplained trips, the emotional distance that had grown between them like a chasm, it all pointed to one thing. "Is there someone else?" he'd asked, his voice hoarse with barely suppressed emotion. Lisa had hesitated, her gaze flickering towards the meticulously arranged family photos on the mantelpiece, each one a silent testament to a life they'd built together. Then, with a sigh that seemed to release years of pent-up frustration, she'd said, "Yes." The words hung in the air, a tangible weight crushing the air out of him. He remembered the way his world had tilted on its axis, the way the blood had drained from his face, leaving him cold and numb. He'd loved Lisa fiercely, devotedly, blindly. The thought of her with another man was like a physical blow, a betrayal that cut deeper than he could have imagined. Now, as he replayed the scene in his mind, a surge of rage coursed through him, raw and primal. He wouldn't let her get away with this. He deserved answers. He deserved to know who had shattered his life, who had dared to touch what was his. His gaze fell on a framed photo on his desk, a picture of him and his 3 closest friends, taken at their annual fishing trip to their lake house. Chris, his lawyer and confidante, grinned roguishly, his arms slung around a reluctant-looking Josh. Mike, the quiet one, stood slightly apart, a knowing smirk playing on his lips. They'd been friends since childhood, sharing everything from their first beers to their deepest secrets. Except, it seemed, this. A chilling thought snaked its way into Mark's mind. What if his friends, his brothers, knew? What if they'd been keeping Lisa's secret, complicit in his humiliation? He grabbed his phone, scrolling through his contacts until he found Chris's number. He hesitated for a moment, then hit the call button. The phone rang twice before Chris picked up, his voice bright and cheerful. "Mark, to what do I owe the pleasure?" "We need to talk," Mark said, his voice tight with suppressed fury. "About Lisa." Chris's cheerful tone faltered for a beat, then resumed with a practiced smoothness. "Lisa, is everything okay? Did you guys have a fight?" "Don't play dumb with me, Chris." Mark snapped. "Lisa wants a divorce. She told me there's someone else." There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line, just long enough to make Mark wonder if his suspicions were right. Then, Chris said, his voice laced with concern, "Wow, Mark, I'm so sorry. I had no idea things were that bad. I know you two have been having your differences lately, but divorce? That's rough. You know Lisa, always keeping things bottled up. If there's anything I can do—" Mark cut him off, his voice dangerously low. "You can tell me if you knew about this. About her, you know, seeing someone else." Chris let out a low whistle. "Whoa, hold on, Mark. I had no idea, I swear. Lisa would never confide in me about something like that, especially not when it concerns you. We're friends, man." His words felt hollow, rehearsed. Mark wanted to believe him, but a seed of doubt had been planted, and it was growing rapidly, fueled by suspicion and hurt. "Look, I have to go," Chris said, his voice taking on an apologetic tone. "I have a meeting with a client in 10 minutes, but call Mike and Josh. We'll meet up, have some beers, and we'll figure this out. You're not going through this alone, buddy." Mark hung up the phone, unconvinced. He knew how good Chris was at his job, at twisting words, at manipulating situations to his advantage. He'd seen him charm judges and disarm opponents with a disarming smile and a well-placed joke. Could his assurances of friendship be another performance, another manipulation? He called Mike and Josh, relaying the news of his impending divorce in clipped, emotionless tones. Both expressed surprise and offered their support, but their words felt hollow, echoing Chris's carefully constructed facade of concern. They agreed to meet at their usual spot, a dimly lit sports bar they'd been frequenting since college. As Mark drove, the knot in his stomach twisted tighter. He was walking into a lion's den, and the lions were his supposed friends. He had to tread carefully. He needed proof, something concrete to confirm or deny his suspicions. But how could he expose the truth when everyone around him seemed determined to keep him in the dark? The familiar neon sign of the bar came into view, casting an eerie glow on the rain-slicked asphalt. Taking a deep breath, Mark steeled himself for the confrontation to come. He had a feeling this was just the beginning of a long, painful battle. He only hoped he wouldn't have to fight it alone. The air inside the bar was thick with the scent of stale beer and disappointment. Mark took a seat at their usual booth, his back to the wall, instinctively surveying the room as if bracing for an ambush. Chris and Josh were already there, nursing beers, their faces etched with exaggerated concern. Mike, typically punctual, was conspicuously absent. "Where's Mike?" Mark asked, his voice flat, devoid of the usual camaraderie. "He said something about a work emergency," Josh offered, his gaze flitting nervously towards the door. "He'll be here." Mark didn't believe it for a second. Not anymore. The web of lies was becoming too tangled, the air too heavy with deceit. He could almost taste it, bitter and metallic, coating his tongue. Chris raised his glass in a mock toast. "Come on, Mark, cheer up. It's just a divorce. Women come and go, but we're here for you, buddy. Always." His words meant to comfort only fueled Mark's anger. They rang hollow, each syllable a reminder of the betrayal he was only beginning to unravel. "Just a divorce?" Mark scoffed, slamming his hand on the table, making the beer glasses rattle. "You make it sound so simple, like it's nothing. 15 years, Chris. We built a life together, a family, and now it's gone, just like that." "Look, Mark," Josh interjected, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant. "Lisa's not the saint you think she is. Maybe this is for the best." Mark's gaze snapped to Josh, his jaw clenched tight. "What's that supposed to mean?" Josh shifted uncomfortably in his seat, avoiding Mark's gaze. "Just that, maybe you should just let it go, man. Start fresh. No need to drag this out." "Let it go?" Mark's voice rose in disbelief. "You think I can just forget about 15 years, about the woman I love, about the life we were supposed to have?" "Love?" Chris laughed, a humorless, brittle sound. "Come on, Mark, you're kidding yourself. Lisa hasn't loved you in years. She's been miserable. We've all seen it." Each word felt like a punch to the gut, confirming what Mark had refused to believe. They knew. They'd known all along, and they'd said nothing. The rage that had been simmering inside him boiled over. He stood abruptly, knocking his chair over with a crash. "Get out," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Get out before I do something we all regret." Chris and Josh exchanged uneasy glances, a flicker of fear finally breaking through their carefully constructed facade. Neither of them had ever seen Mark like this, his anger a palpable force radiating through the booth. They sensed this was not a fight they could win, not tonight. "Come on, Mark," Chris said, rising slowly, his voice placating. "Let's not do anything rash. We're just trying to help." "Help?" Mark laughed, the sound humorless and raw. "By covering for her? By letting her make a fool of me?" "No one's making a fool of you," Josh mumbled, his gaze fixed on the table. "Then tell me," Mark pressed, his voice low and dangerous. "Tell me who she's seeing. Tell me you don't know. Look me in the eye and lie to my face." A heavy silence descended upon the booth, punctuated only by the murmur of conversations and the clinking of glasses from the surrounding tables. Chris and Josh shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting nervously between each other and the floor. Their silence spoke volumes. Mark felt a surge of nausea mixed with a strange sense of vindication. He'd known it deep down, but confirmation felt like a punch to the gut. His friends, his brothers, were complicit in his wife's betrayal. He turned to leave, his fists clenched, his mind a whirlwind of anger and hurt. He'd deal with them later. Right now, he needed air, space to breathe, to process the magnitude of the betrayal. As he stormed out of the bar, a movement in the shadows caught his eye. He turned just in time to see Mike's truck pulling out of the parking lot at the far end, heading away from the bar. The streetlights illuminated the truck's cab for a fleeting moment, revealing a flash of blonde hair in the passenger seat. Lisa's hair. Mark stopped dead in his tracks, a cold fury washing over him, erasing any lingering doubt. It was Mike. The quiet one, the one he least suspected, had been sleeping with his wife. And Chris and Josh had known all along, covering for them, laughing behind his back. He felt a surge of primal rage, an urge to chase after them, to confront them, to inflict pain equal to what he was feeling. But as quickly as it came, the rage subsided, replaced by a steely resolve. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing him break. He wouldn't play the role of the betrayed husband, the heartbroken fool. He would have his revenge, cold, calculated, and devastating. And it would be all the sweeter knowing they'd handed him the weapon. The following days were a blur of anger, hurt, and a cold, steely determination. Mark moved through the motions of his life, work, meetings, meals, like a ghost, his mind consumed with a single-minded focus, revenge. He couldn't simply walk away, couldn't let Lisa, Mike, and their accomplices escape unscathed. They'd made a mockery of his trust, of their friendship, of his life. He wouldn't rest until they understood the true meaning of pain, the kind that lingered long after the wounds had healed. His first target was easy. Chris, with his carefully constructed facade of respectability, his web of influence built on lies and manipulation, would be the first to fall. Mark remembered the day he'd helped Chris set up his home office, the pride in his friend's voice as he'd explained the intricacies of his state-of-the-art security system. It was meant to protect his family, his clients' secrets. Mark had even helped him install the hidden cameras positioned for maximum coverage, accessible remotely from Chris's phone. Now those cameras would be Chris's undoing. Using his old IT skills Chris had always dismissed as beneath him, Mark found a backdoor into the system. It was surprisingly easy. Arrogance, Mark realized, was often a prelude to a fall. He watched, his blood running cold, as Chris, oblivious to the unseen observer, entertained Lisa in his own home, the very same house where Chris's wife and children slept peacefully upstairs. The intimacy of their interactions, the casual betrayals, the laughter that felt like a knife twisting in Mark's gut, it was all there, captured in high definition, a testament to their deceit. Mark saved the recordings, date and time stamped, each one a nail in Chris's coffin. He'd considered sending them to Chris's wife, but quickly discarded the idea. She didn't deserve this pain, not from him. No, his revenge would be targeted, precise, and ultimately far more devastating. He anonymously sent the recordings to the State Bar Association, along with a detailed account of Chris's ethical violations, his conflicts of interest, his blatant disregard for professional conduct. The wheels of justice, once greased by Chris's charm and connections, would now grind him down, slowly and methodically. Mark's next target was Josh, the youngest of their group, always eager to please, easily led. Josh, who had the most to lose. He'd married young, into money. Pam, his wife, was the epitome of old money grace and poise, a stark contrast to Josh's more boisterous, impulsive nature. Their marriage, while seemingly idyllic from the outside, was built on a foundation of carefully negotiated compromises and unspoken expectations. Mark knew Josh's weakness was his ambition, his desire to climb the social ladder, to prove himself worthy of the world Pam had opened up to him. A world built on appearances, on whispers and rumors, on maintaining a facade of respectability. Mark set his trap carefully, using a burner phone and a newly created email address to contact a gossip columnist known for her ruthless pursuit of scandal among the city's elite. He anonymously fed her tidbits of information, carefully chosen to pique her interest without revealing his hand. He hinted at a high society wife, her husband's infidelity with a close friend, a web of deceit that stretched back years. The columnist, sensing a juicy story, quickly picked up the scent, her interest further fueled by Mark's carefully placed roadblocks and dead ends. She saw a challenge, a chance to make a name for herself by exposing the hypocrisy at the heart of the city's most powerful families. It didn't take long for the whispers to reach Pam's ears. The social circles she moved in were small, insular, and rife with gossip. Soon the rumors were everywhere, fueled by Mark's carefully placed hints and innuendos. Pam, known for her grace under pressure, began to crack. She confronted Josh, her questions laced with ice, her disappointment palpable. He denied everything, of course, but the seeds of doubt had been sown. Pam, despite her wealth and privilege, was not immune to the pain of betrayal. Mark watched from a distance, a sense of grim satisfaction settling over him. Josh would pay, not necessarily for his infidelity, but for his betrayal, for his complicity in the charade that had shattered Mark's life. Dealing with Mike proved to be more challenging. The quiet one, the observer, always lurking on the periphery, proved to be surprisingly adept at covering his tracks. He was careful, calculated, his betrayal a reflection of his cautious nature. But Mark knew Mike better than he thought. He knew Mike craved what he couldn't have, coveted the things that came easily to others. He'd seen it in the way Mike looked at Lisa, the envy masked by a veneer of concern, the admiration tinged with something darker, something possessive. Mark's anger towards Mike was a living thing, a cold fury that fueled his need for retribution. This wasn't just about Lisa anymore. This was about the shattering of a bond, the violation of a trust that ran deeper than mere friendship. He discovered Mike's weakness was Ashley, his wife. She was a free spirit, artistic, independent, everything Mike wasn't. They'd met in college, a whirlwind romance that surprised everyone who knew them. Mike, the quiet, dependable one, had been swept off his feet by Ashley's vibrancy, her zest for life. But beneath Ashley's carefree exterior, Mark sensed a deep well of vulnerability, a need for genuine connection that Mike, with his secrets and lies, could never truly fulfill. Mark knew that direct confrontation wouldn't work with Mike. He was too cautious, too adept at weaving plausible denials. No, Mark needed to expose Mike's true nature, to reveal the man behind the mask of quiet respectability. He anonymously sent Ashley a package, a simple brown envelope with no return address. Inside, he placed a single flash drive, its contents encrypted for her eyes only. On the drive, he'd placed copies of the security footage from Chris's house, along with a series of emails between Mike and Lisa, their words a testament to their affair, their betrayal laid bare for all to see. He didn't include any explanation, no accusations, no demands, just the cold, hard evidence of their deceit. He knew Ashley, despite her free spirit, valued honesty above all else. The wait was agonizing. Days turned into weeks, each hour stretching out like an eternity. Mark threw himself into work, the demands of running his family's logistics company a welcome distraction from the turmoil that raged within him. He knew he'd set his plan in motion, but he had no control over the outcome. The call came on a Friday afternoon, just as Mark was about to lock up his office for the weekend. It was Karen, his secretary, her voice tight with a mixture of concern and apprehension. "Mark, there's a woman here to see you, says it's important." "Did she give her name?" Ashley. Karen hesitated, then added, "Miller." Mark's grip tightened on the phone. Ashley was here. He'd been expecting this, dreading it even, but now that it was happening, a strange calmness settled over him. "Send her in, Karen." He hung up the phone and walked around his desk, straightening papers, adjusting the family photos that felt like accusations in the face of his shattered life. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for the confrontation to come. Ashley stood hesitantly at the doorway, her usual vibrancy dimmed, her eyes red-rimmed, as if she'd been crying. She looked smaller somehow, more fragile than he remembered. "May I come in?" Her voice was barely a whisper. Mark gestured towards the chair facing his desk. "Please." She sat down, her gaze fixed on her hands, her fingers twisting nervously in her lap. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words, with the weight of shared pain. "I got your package," Ashley said finally, her voice cracking slightly. Mark simply nodded, unable to find the words to fill the silence. "It's true then?" Ashley asked, her voice barely audible. "Everything in those videos, those emails, it's all true?" Mark felt a pang of sympathy for her, for the pain etched on her face, the betrayal mirrored in her tear-filled eyes. But his anger, though tempered now, still burned, a steady flame fueled by years of suppressed hurt. "Yes," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "It's all true." Ashley raised her head then, her eyes meeting Mark's for the first time. The tears were gone now, replaced by a look of steely resolve that surprised him. It was the look of someone who had stared into the abyss and found the strength to climb back out. "What are you going to do?" she asked, her voice steady now, though still laced with a tremor of vulnerability. "I don't know yet," Mark admitted, surprised by his own honesty. He'd spent weeks consumed by his plan for revenge, plotting each step with the precision of a military strategist. But now, faced with the raw pain in Ashley's eyes, the weight of his actions felt heavier, the satisfaction he'd expected to feel strangely absent. "Mike," he tried to explain, Ashley said, her voice laced with a weariness that spoke of countless arguments, of pleas fallen on deaf ears. He said it was just a fling, that it meant nothing. Mark felt a surge of anger, a primal urge to lash out, to defend not just himself, but the sanctity of what they'd all shared, the bonds of friendship they'd forged over a lifetime. He thought of the countless dinners, the holidays spent together, the easy camaraderie he'd believed was unbreakable. How could they have sat across from him, shared meals, laughed at his jokes, all the while knowing what lay beneath the surface, the secrets and lies festering like a hidden infection? It wasn't a fling, Mark said, his voice flat, emotionless. It's been going on for years. Ashley's hand flew to her mouth, stifling a gasp. The color drained from her face, leaving her pale and shaken. Mark hesitated, then added, softer this time, I'm sorry, Ashley. I shouldn't have. No, she interrupted, her voice firm. You had every right. I deserved to know. We both did. She stood up, her movements shaky but determined. What are you going to do about Mike? She asked again, her gaze unwavering. Mark looked at her, at the pain and the surprising strength etched on her face. He realized then that his revenge, however meticulously planned, paled in comparison to the consequences already unfolding. They were caught in a web of their own making, and the fallout would be messy, unpredictable, and ultimately out of his control. He took a deep breath, the weight of his decisions pressing down on him. I'm going to ruin him, he said, the words leaving a bitter taste in his mouth. A strange sense of calm settled over Mark as he uttered the words, a sense of purpose that had eluded him for weeks. It wasn't about satisfaction anymore, or even about inflicting pain. It was about reclaiming his life, about taking control of the narrative that had spiraled out of control. Ashley surprised him with a sad smile. Good, she said, her voice devoid of malice, but filled with a quiet strength that spoke of a battle already won. He deserves everything that's coming to him. She turned to leave, then paused at the doorway, her gaze meeting his once more. What about Lisa? Mark hesitated. Lisa, the woman who had been his world for 15 years, the mother of his children, the architect of his downfall. His anger towards her was a tangled knot of hurt, betrayal, and a lingering sense of disbelief. He'd loved her, fiercely, blindly, and she had used that love, that trust, as a weapon against him. He thought of the life they'd built together, the memories they'd made, the dreams they'd shared, all of it tainted now by her deception. He'd wanted to hurt her, to make her pay for the pain she'd caused. But as he looked at Ashley, he saw a strength in her, a resilience born of facing her own demons, that gave him pause. He realized that Lisa, despite her betrayal, was just a pawn in a game orchestrated by men who sought to control, to possess, to hold on to a power they didn't deserve. She's made her choices, Mark said finally, his voice heavy with resignation. She'll have to live with them. Ashley nodded, a flicker of understanding in her eyes. She knew that sometimes the greatest revenge was simply walking away, letting go of the anger and the hurt, and allowing life to unfold on its own terms. It was a lesson they were all learning in their own painful way. As Ashley left his office, Mark leaned back in his chair, a wave of exhaustion washing over him. The battle had just begun, but he was no longer the same man who had walked into that bar a few weeks ago, blindsided and reeling from betrayal. He'd looked into the abyss, and he'd found something within himself, a strength he hadn't known he possessed. He picked up his phone, dialing a number he'd memorized long ago. It was time to play offense. It was time for Mike Miller to understand the true cost of betrayal. Mike made his way over to the booth, his steps slow, as if approaching a judge awaiting his sentence. He slid into the seat across from Mark, his gaze fixed on the tabletop, avoiding Mark's eyes. Coffee? Mark asked, gesturing to the pot the waitress had placed on the table. It felt strange, following the familiar script of their shared routine, the pretense of normalcy a stark contrast to the turmoil that raged beneath the surface. Mike shook his head, his lips pressed into a thin line. No, thanks. He finally met Mark's gaze, his own eyes bloodshot, filled with a mixture of fear and defiance. Ashley, she told you everything? Mark nodded, watching Mike's reaction closely. His friend's usually impassive face was a mask of barely suppressed panic, the carefully constructed facade crumbling under the weight of his betrayal. I don't know what to say, Mike stammered, his voice hoarse. I messed up. I know that. I never meant to hurt Ashley, or you. Mark let out a humorless laugh, the sound sharp and bitter in the quiet diner. You never meant to hurt us? That's rich, Mike. Sleeping with my wife, betraying a friendship that spanned decades. That doesn't sound like not meaning to hurt us. Mike flinched as if struck, his gaze dropping back to the tabletop. It wasn't like that, he mumbled, his voice barely audible. Oh, really? Mark leaned forward, his voice dangerously low. Then what was it like, Mike? Enlighten me. Mike shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his hands clenching into fists on the tabletop. Lisa, she wasn't happy. You weren't there for her. Mark felt a surge of anger, raw and primal. So you were there for her? That's your excuse? You couldn't find a way to be a decent human being, to be a friend, without betraying me in the worst possible way? I cared about her, Mike stammered, his voice cracking. Cared about her? Mark's voice rose in disbelief. You used her, Mike. You used her to get back at me, to feel something, anything, other than the pathetic loser you see in the mirror every morning. Mike's head snapped up, his eyes blazing with sudden anger. That's not fair, Mark. You don't know anything about me. You've always been the golden boy, the one with everything handed to him, the successful business, the perfect family, the adoring friends. Mark stared at him, stunned by the venom in his friend's voice. He'd always known Mike harbored a certain resentment towards him, a quiet envy that he'd tried to ignore, to explain away as harmless insecurity. Now he realized it was something far more insidious, a festering wound that had poisoned their friendship from the inside out. So that's it? Mark said, his voice cold, devoid of emotion. You slept with my wife because you were jealous? Because you felt entitled to a piece of my life? It wasn't just that, Mike shot back, his defiance crumbling under the weight of Mark's gaze. Lisa, she made me feel seen, like she actually listened to me, understood me in a way you never did. Mark felt a hollow ache in his chest, a painful reminder of the distance that had grown between him and Lisa over the years. He'd been so focused on providing for his family, on building a future, that he'd failed to see the cracks in the foundation, the silent cries for help. But even as he acknowledged his own failings, he couldn't forgive Mike's betrayal. It was one thing to seek comfort in the arms of another, but quite another to do so with the husband of your supposed friend, to actively participate in the destruction of his life. You're delusional, Mike, Mark said, his voice devoid of inflection. Lisa used you, just like she used Chris and Josh. You were just another pawn in her game, a way to fill the void in her own life. Mike opened his mouth to protest, but Mark cut him off. It's over, Mike. Ashley knows, and I'm going to make sure everyone else does too. You're going to lose everything. Your wife, your friends, your reputation. It's only a matter of time. He stood up, his breakfast lying heavy and uneaten on his plate. As he turned to leave, he looked down at his former friend, at the broken man slumped in the booth, his face etched with a mixture of fear and regret. I almost pity you, Mike, Mark said, his voice barely a whisper. Almost. And with that, he walked out of the diner, leaving behind the wreckage of their friendship, the shattered pieces of a past he could never reclaim. Mark's confrontation with Mike had been draining, a painful severing of a bond that had once seemed unbreakable, but it had also been strangely liberating. The truth, no matter how ugly, had been spoken. The charade was over. He knew Mike wouldn't stay silent. He'd fight back, try to salvage what remained of his life. But Mark had the element of surprise, the moral high ground, however tarnished, on his side. He'd already set his plan in motion. Using his contacts in the logistics industry, he began to spread rumors about Mike's business practices, subtly suggesting financial irregularities, hinting at shady deals that crossed the line of legality. It wasn't hard. Trust, once broken, was difficult to repair, especially in an industry built on reputation and reliability. He knew Ashley wouldn't take his side publicly. He wouldn't ask her to relive her own pain for his sake, but her silence spoke volumes. The whispers started, then grew into murmurs, then amplified by the ever-hungry gossip mill, quickly becoming a roar that threatened to engulf Mike's world. Word reached Pam, Josh's wife, her social circles buzzing with the latest scandal. She'd already been teetering on the edge, her suspicions fueled by Mark's carefully placed hints. Now, with Mike's infidelity exposed, the pieces fell into place. Josh's denials, his pleas for forgiveness, fell on deaf ears. Pam, despite her sheltered upbringing, was no fool. She'd seen the way Josh looked at Lisa, the envy, the barely concealed desire, mirrored in the eyes of all three of Mark's supposed friends. She filed for divorce, her lawyers, the city's most ruthless, moving with a swiftness that spoke of deep pockets and even deeper anger. Josh, stripped of his wealth, his status, his carefully constructed facade, was left with nothing but the wreckage of his own making. Chris, facing mounting pressure from the Bar Association, his carefully crafted life unraveling under the weight of his own deceit, chose the coward's way out. He resigned from his prestigious firm, citing personal reasons, hoping to disappear into the anonymity of a quiet life, far from the whispers and the judging eyes of the city that had once embraced him. Mark watched it all unfold from a distance, his anger slowly giving way to a weary emptiness. His revenge, meticulously planned and executed, had brought him no satisfaction, only the bitter taste of ashes in his mouth. He'd destroyed his enemies, but in the process, he'd also destroyed a part of himself. The house felt empty without Lisa, the silence echoing the hollowness within him. He focused on his children, their innocent eyes a constant reminder of the life he was fighting to rebuild, the future he was determined to salvage from the wreckage. He was no longer the man he'd been before the betrayal. He was something harder now, more jaded, a survivor forged in the fires of his own personal hell. And as he looked out at the wreckage of his life, he knew that the true cost of revenge was often a heavy one to bear. The months that followed were a time of rebuilding, of picking up the pieces of his shattered life and forging a new path forward. Mark threw himself into work, finding solace in the familiar rhythms of the family business, the tangible evidence of his own hard work and dedication. He bought out his parents, giving them the retirement they deserved, and steered the company towards a more sustainable future, one built on integrity and transparency. He'd learned the hard way the cost of cutting corners, of sacrificing principles for profit. His children, thankfully, seemed to be adjusting to their new reality with surprising resilience. They were young, their laughter and unconditional love a balm on Mark's wounded soul. He made sure they had everything they needed, lavishing them with attention and affection, determined to shield them from the ugliness that had tainted their lives. He heard whispers, of course, about Lisa, about the consequences of her choices. She'd lost everything, her social standing, her friends, her lavish lifestyle. She'd moved into a modest apartment on the other side of town, taking a job at a local bookstore, her days filled with the quiet anonymity she'd once craved. Mark felt no satisfaction in her downfall, only a weary sadness for what could have been. They were strangers now, bound only by the shared history they'd tried so hard to erase. One evening, as Mark was tucking his daughter into bed, she looked up at him, her eyes wide with a child's innocent curiosity. "Daddy, are you ever going to get married again?" Mark smiled, smoothing her hair back from her forehead. "I don't know, sweetheart. Maybe someday. But right now, I have you and your brother, and that's all that matters." His daughter yawned, her eyelids already drooping with sleep. "But what about love?" she mumbled, her words slurring slightly. "Don't you miss loving Mommy?" Mark's smile faltered, the question striking a chord deep within him. Did he miss loving Lisa? He missed the companionship, the shared history, the comfort of familiarity. But love? That was a more complicated question. "Love changes, sweetheart," he said finally, choosing his words carefully. "Sometimes it grows stronger, and sometimes it fades away. But that doesn't mean it wasn't real." His daughter, her young mind already drifting towards sleep, seemed satisfied with his answer. She snuggled deeper into her blankets, her breathing soft and even. Mark sat beside her for a long moment, watching her sleep, his heart heavy with a bittersweet mix of regret and gratitude. He'd lost a lot, but he still had his children, his integrity, and a newfound appreciation for the fragility of trust, the ephemeral nature of love, and the enduring power of forgiveness. As he turned off the light and closed his daughter's door, he realized that true revenge wasn't about destruction, but about rebuilding, about finding peace amidst the wreckage, and about embracing the uncertain future with a heart open to the possibility of healing, and perhaps even love once more.